Hello everyone. So it's five of us, right? So we have to get started. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's not easy to come here, right? Uh, um, I think that I will ask a friend, ask a student to actually videotape the whole lecture, so that later we'll actually upload the lecture actually to Canvas. So if you have any questions regarding the slides, or if your friends have any questions regarding the slides, please feel free to drop by my office, right? Basically, I'll be here every day this week at least, right? So basically, you can actually drop by at any time you want, because I know this unusual circumstance and you might have a lot of questions in mind. So I think it's a difficult time, but we have to get through this together. Okay, hopefully we can get through this together. Let's get started. Even if we don't have like a few people, we do have to go ahead because we have a lot of things to cover. And then it's about like the organizational networks, right? So last time we talked about like sometimes the public organizations cannot actually fulfill its missions alone or by themselves. So that's the reason they often have to actually resort to partnerships with other sector players, like the private sector players or like the non-profits, right? So when you have a network involving the government or at least the public sector organizations, then you're actually forging an organizational network that we call it the public sector organizational network, right? So basically it has its challenges and it has its actually promises. So it has a lot of aspects, and last time we talked about some of the issues that can actually define a good network or can actually forge good network management, right? So that's what we talked about last time. And then starting from this week, we have to go ahead and actually try to actually make sense of the kind of the collaborative governance, namely the kind of public sector governance network, right? So when you actually have a network involving the government, meaning that you have like partnerships among the government players and actually the non-government entities, then you're actually entering the phase of collaborative governance, right? Because you have the keyword governance here, so you must actually have the government players, and then it's collaborative in nature, right? So because we are talking about the partnerships, right, among those different sector players. So that's the kind of the official term. We actually term it as the collaborative governance. So what does that actually mean, right? So basically what's in red are important, right? So basically it means the partnerships involving the government, as I just said, business, right? The private sector players, the non-profit, and philanthropists, right? And sometimes, we're talking about the importance of the public involvement or civic engagement, right? So basically it also actually involves like local communities and the public as a whole to actually jointly provide or collectively actually provide public goods and services. So eventually we can actually achieve an outcome that could not be achieved by those sectors alone, right? That actually could not be achieved by those sectors alone, right? So basically that's the definition of this, right? Let's just at least pay attention to the definition, right? So during the exam, if I ask you guys to actually tell me what collaborative governance is, right, to actually define the term, you do have to understand that it actually, you do have to capture a few keywords here, right? The partnership involving government and those kind of non-governmental entities, and then to collectively deliver public goods and services. So eventually we can forge an outcome that cannot be achieved by any particular or any individual sector players alone, right? So basically that's what we actually want to emphasize here. And basically, the reason that we do have to actually resort to collaborative governance, that the government needs to actually collaborate or cooperate with other sector players, it's just very simple and straightforward. It's like sometimes the government cannot actually work on itself, and sometimes you do have to understand that the government sometimes when they operate by themselves, they're very costly. They're very costly. It's not cheap, and then sometimes it's not even effective, right? Because for government players or for those public organizations, they don't actually compete in a marketplace, right? They don't compete in a marketplace. So that actually gives them an edge to be sloppy or to be a little bit slack, right? Because of this, right, to irradiate or to eliminate the issue of inefficiency or kind of unresponsiveness, right? To actually eliminate those issues or to actually increase the possibility of forging some good outcomes in a very cost-effective way, we do have to resort to collaborative governance, right? Because we know that at the bottom, right, sometimes the public organizations, they don't actually operate very efficiently, and for some of the missions that are very complicated, they can't actually achieve them all by themselves, right? So basically that's the kind of the reason for this. And we also understand that there's a long-standing critique of the effectiveness of the government when it acts on its own. Because it means like sometimes people think that when government acts on its own, it's not effective, it's not efficient, right? So that's the reason like for following the footsteps of the new public management, we're entering the phase of a collaborative scheme. Everything it will be collaborative in nature. So basically that's something that we actually want to emphasize, right? So just actually pay attention to this, right? And then also, you do have to understand that even if we say like we're entering a phase of like collaborative governance, you have to understand that collaborative governance is not the panacea, it's not the silver bullet to solving any of the issues, or to solving like all the issues that you care about, right? Yes, to actually just to be like a silver bullet where you have something that it will always come to rescue. That's not the case. That's not exactly the case, because you do have to understand that in this world things are interconnected, right? Things are super interconnected, right? Saying like here as an example, right? Even for like healthcare, right? It actually can be defined, or it can be actually redefined, or actually framed as an issue of like economic competitiveness, industrial policy, education policy, and actually more. So in this case, like collaborative governance can actually help solve some aspects of it, but it cannot actually take care of all the aspects, right? So because of this, you do have to understand that sometimes you want to take a step back, you want the government to provide things on itself, such as the national defense, right? Sometimes you want to actually resort to collaborative governance in one sector, in one arena, in one territory, right? And sometimes you want to you want to have a collaborative scheme to actually cover all bases, right? So basically, you do have to understand that it's a very effective way and it's a trend, but it's not the silver bullet. It's not the panacea to solve all the issues that you care about, right? Sometimes you do have to play it by ears, meaning that you do have to improvise a little bit. Depending on the circumstances, you have to improvise, right? You do have to choose the right path to go. Most likely it's collaborative governance, but there are occasions where you have to actually do something else. And even within the scheme of collaborative governance, how could you actually detail those specifics, right? Depends on the nature of the issues eventually. Right? So let's just actually put things straight here, right? And then basically sometimes those scholars would actually ponder that when will kind of the cross-sector or kind of the collaborative governance be adopted, right? So sometimes people actually ask themselves or ask around those questions, the circumstances under which the collaborative governance will be adopted. Well, there are a lot of circumstances and we can't exhaust all of them, but at least there are a few typical ones that we can actually list, right? The first one is about turbulent environment, right? Cross-sector collaborations, meaning that the collaboration among those sectors, right? Public, private, non-profit, blah, 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 right? They're more likely to form in turbulent environment, right? Because like in turbulent environment, there are a lot of uncertainties, as we're now experiencing a very turbulent environment, right? So basically there are a lot of uncertainties. And then government seems like, by itself, seems to be a little bit weak in dealing with all these uncertainties. And sometimes the people don't actually trust the government, right? So in this way, you have to resort to collaboration, right? You have to actually find a very kind of trustworthy third party. You have to actually find someone else to at least get involved in the process, right? So that we can actually earn the trust, so we can solve the issue with ease, or at least we can move forward a little bit. Right? So in those turbulent environments, we understand that kind of the cross-sectoral collaborations are more likely to forge. Because if the environment is so stable, and then if the government is very comfortable providing the service all by itself, and then nothing has changed, no external things have actually ever occurred. So basically, there's no motivation for governments to change. We will just keep the status quo. We'll just keep things going, right? So because of the turbulence of the environment, sometimes things will actually change all of a sudden. And then because of this, because of many uncertainties, we actually resort to cross-sector collaboration. Right? And then the second thing is like public value or public failures. So remember, like a few weeks ago, we talked about the market failure. We talked about that sometimes the market cannot actually rescue itself from a lot of the failures, such as the externalities, negative externalities and the kind of the free riding issues. So we need public organizations to step in, right? But now we also have to understand that for public sectors, they also have the situation. They will at least also encounter the situations that they will actually fail, right? They would actually fail, right? So we also, in addition to the kind of the market failure, we also have the public failures, and then because we have to actually counteract the effects of those public failures, we have to resort to collaborative schemes, right? We have to actually resort to collaborative schemes, right? So sometimes here I said like public policymakers are most likely to try cross-sector collaboration when they believe that the separate efforts of different sectors to address a public policy has failed or are likely to fail, right? So in this case, when we actually have the kind of the public failures, meaning that the public organizations find itself unable or find its inability to solve a lot of the issues at hand, then they have to actually resort to collaborative governance. Right? So basically, when we have the public value failures, or when we have the failures resulting from the public organizations, right? We have a few options. We can live with the problems, right? Because everyone knows that in this world we have a lot of problems. Sometimes we don't deal with it. At least we don't deal with each one of this. For some of the problems, we just live with the problem, right? So be it, right? And then sometimes there are a lot of problems where we actually engage in symbolic action that does little to address the problem, right? Basically, people say like for a lot of controversial issues, like the government doesn't want to actually play the back cop, right? So sometimes they actually do a little bit kind of symbolic actions, but they didn't actually redress the problems at its root cause, right? So we do have to understand that there are issues that you just live with. There are issues that you just actually address it symbolically, right? There are also issues that you have to mobilize collective action to fashion a cross-sector solution that holds the promise of actually creating the public values, to actually solve those public sector failures, So at the end of the day, first you have to understand that in addition to the market failure, the public organizations can also fail, right? Because sometimes, because of its inability to solve some of the critical issues in society, right? So that we have the problem of the public sector failures. To deal with the public sector failures, there are a few options, a few alternatives. You can do nothing, you can just live with it, right? Or you can just try to actually do things very superficially, right? Or you can try to actually mobilize resources to solve it at its root cause, right? There are three options, right? And most likely, for some critical issues, we want to solve the problems internally, right? We want to actually solve the problem at least permanently or as institutionally, but the government cannot actually solve the problems all by itself because of the because of the public failures, right? So we do have to actually resort to collaborative governance scheme so that things can be solved, so that we can ultimately embrace the public value, to make sure that everything will be actually held in justice, right? So that's the second point that I want to emphasize, right? And the third point is like cross-sectoral collaboration are more likely to succeed when more and more linking mechanisms, such as some brokers or kind of the middlemen, are actually in place, right? So sometimes, I mean, in many circumstances, we actually hope to actually have the cross-sector collaboration, but in some circumstances, we fail to eventually have a collaborative governance scheme. Well, we fail to actually forge a collaboration, right? In other circumstances, in other situations, we actually have that, right? So everyone has actually encountered this kind of the problem in your daily life, right? Sometimes you want to cooperate so badly with someone else, well, eventually the collaboration cannot actually go through. Well, other cases you are very good at, or at least a collaboration is forged, right? So basically, we have to ask ourselves, why? What? Sometimes we're eager to collaborate all the time, right? At least, right? But why sometimes we have the collaboration, whereas in other times, well, the collaboration cannot be forged, right? I think that one of the issues is like whether or not you have some kind of linking mechanisms, whether or not you have some kind of the middleman, some sponsors, some kind of brokers to facilitate or to smoothen the process, right? Saying like, okay, you want to collaborate with someone else, that one is very kind of, how can we say, that person is a little bit cranky, is a little bit kind of not a very easygoing person. So sometimes if you just go ahead and actually ask for collaboration, you might be rejected. You might be, right? However, if you have a broker saying like you guys have a mutual friend, and that friend would actually say something to him, would actually say something to you, and then we actually get you guys together for a dinner or something, and then things will be talked out, and then you guys can actually collaborate, right? So sometimes it depends on that critical person that eventually your request can be accepted, your demand can be accepted, and like basically your wishes can be fulfilled, right? So basically the same is for actually what? For collaborative governance scheme for government as well. Sometimes you need some linking mechanisms. You need some kind of those kind of very famous organizations, famous consulting agencies, right? So they can play the middleman well. They can play that role. So eventually the collaboration can be forged. Because you have to understand that the government is very arrogant. They don't actually kiss your ass, or they don't actually try to actually say something nice about you, right? So you have to actually ask for collaboration. You have to take the initiative to ask for collaboration, right? Sometimes for a lot of kind of the big companies, they don't want to actually do so. They feel like it's kind of it doesn't actually save their face really well. So right, so sometimes the collaboration cannot go through. So someone has to take the first step, and most likely it's those linking mechanisms, right? Who actually forge, or who at least try to actually get the willingness of each party on board and actually try to actually forge some collaboration. Right? So let's just say, okay, there are like 3 major circumstances under which, right, the collaborative governance can be forged. Okay. I guess there's no question. Okay, and then here is an important concept. We're now living in a world, we call that the hollow state. The hollow state. What does that even mean? It means like nowadays the government uses collaborative governance schemes so often, so frequently, that the government stops providing any of the goods, public goods and services by itself. It relies totally and completely on those third parties, on those non-governmental entities and organizations and enterprises to provide the services on their behalf. So eventually the whole state is hollowed out. The whole state is hollowed out because the government doesn't possess any of the production functions, right? The government doesn't provide any of the service in-house. Anything relating to the public service and public goods are provided by those third party or by those non-governmental players on behalf of the government, of the government, right? So basically what's important, nowadays the governments are making an increasing use of third parties, often non-profits, and sometimes the private sector players, right, to deliver the social services and generally act in the name of the state. Generally actually act in the name of the state, right? So when this actually problem, or when this, not a problem, sorry, but when this phenomenon is actually carried to the extreme, right, the state is hollowed out. Because then you don't have like government anymore, right? Because the government seems to be what hollowed out because it doesn't provide any of the public goods and services as it's supposed to be. Right? Because everything is provided by third party or by the non-profits, by the private sector players, then the government just play the role as a supervisor of those contracts, right? Just oversees the contracts, right? So basically, what if like one day those kind of the non-governmental players stops or actually just stops actually playing the role or stops actually providing the services, and then basically the government has, basically their hands are tied. Basically, they can't do anything, right? You can imagine like the whole city, the whole state will be stopped, will be paralyzed in a sense, right? Because it doesn't have the machine, it doesn't have the functions all by itself. It relies totally on those kind of the non-profits or kind of the private sector players, right? So it's risky. It's risky, right? Most of the circumstances, yes, it's okay, but in some circumstances, if you actually carry that to the extreme, you have to imagine the problem. You have to imagine the problem. It's like one day, what if those kind of the private sector players stopped actually providing services on your behalf? They don't want to actually earn money from you, right? And then how would you actually provide services to the public? Well, you can resume that, but it takes time. But it's just very risky, right? So sometimes you can imagine when the city is paralyzed, right? You can't even actually find the public transportation back home, right? Basically, that's the issue that is actually facing us. Right? So, I mean, it's a trend, but we're saying like it's currently a little bit dangerous, but most likely you have no solution to this issue because if the government provides anything in-house, it's too expensive and sometimes not efficient. And then the problem or the circumstances of like no private sector players are willing to provide any of the services. I mean, that circumstances that circumstance would unlikely to occur. So basically, you are okay. But you do have to understand that sometimes when people are criticizing about the hollow state, they have a point. They have a point, right? So basically, that's what I want to say. It's like that is the government actually contract out all its production capabilities to third parties, right? Everything is contracted out. You actually forge those contracts. You actually collaborate with different third parties, right? So basically, you don't provide anything by yourself, right? Saying like it's just suppose like you are a student, you're supposed to write, you're supposed to complete assignments, right? But you contract out, right? You pay someone to do your Chinese work, you pay someone to do your math, you pay someone to do your English, you pay someone to do your physics, right? So everything's contracted out, right? If you have money, yeah, it's okay. But the problem is like it's risky, right? What if one day those people don't actually want to provide their services to you, and then you do have to take the exam, and then basically you have no capability to fulfill or to complete the exam because everything is contracted out, and you don't learn that very kind of the assiduously and immediately at hand, right? So basically, you do have to imagine that when that things happened, like you are hollowed out. You are hollowed out, right? So basically, we're using a metaphorical term to actually to describe the situation as a hollow state. As a hollow state, it's like when everything is contracted out and no in-house production ever occurs, right? So the whole state is hollowed out. The whole state is hollowed out. So we're embracing a world with a hollow state because that's what exactly the government is doing there. Please.
What kind of services apart from national security should the government keep in-house?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think that depends, right? Because each country has its own kind of the concerns. I think like sometimes people can say like saying like in Great Britain, like even for the water supply, it's actually provided by the third party, right? By some kind of the even some kind of the millionaires here in Hong Kong, right? So they actually purchase or they own the company of those water supply functions. So I think that for me it's risky because if you actually let someone let a businessman to actually operate your pipelines to make sure like okay everyone to make sure like people's drinking to actually have the situation whereas people's drinking water comes from a private company. So and that's risky to me because it seems like one day if that person stops or if that person just try to do something to the system and then everyone has to suffer. Saying like okay he is just a very vengeful person, like he actually buys all the kind of the pipelines and he actually controls the provision of the drinking water of the whole country. And what if one day he just gets out of his mind, he just asks his employees to actually to at least to poison the water. You can imagine like the whole state, I mean what will happen, it will be catastrophic, right? He doesn't mind dying, right? Because perhaps like he's actually nearing his end of the day, end of the game at least, right? So he feel like okay I want a lot of people to die with me together, right? I don't care, right? So basically that could be one of the circumstances, right? So to me, that's a risky thing. So basically, like at least in many Asian countries, including China, we don't let those kind of the private sector players to actually to take control of the natural resources, like water, like the kind of the electricity. I mean, those things are actually owned by the state. Those things, those kind of the critical resources are provided by the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, right? So we think that's critical, right? But in a lot of Western countries, those things are kind of contracted out as well. So basically, there's no one kind of absolute answer to your question because it depends on how the leaders think of the issue, right? If they think that the issue is important, if they think okay that thing is very critical and we can't let any third party to step in the process, they will try to keep it in-house. But if they think like, okay, we don't think that those kind of dire or kind of those extreme circumstances would actually ever happen, and then we think that we want to find a way to provide things cheaply and daily, right? So basically they will try to actually resort to the third parties and then everything will be hollowed out, right? So it depends. Like in some countries, particularly for those big countries, they will keep a lot of things in-house, like the national defense, like the preservation of the natural resources, like some kind of the big public transportations, like the high-speed railway. I mean, they will keep those things in-house, provided by the SOEs, right? But in some small countries, they can afford to hollow everything out because it's small. It's unlikely to create a massive problem. But in big countries, like China, right? You can imagine like if something happens, it will be at a massive scale. So that the government cannot afford to risk it, right? It depends. Okay. Right? So we do have to understand, okay, when we have a hollow state, right, the first thing is like it's risky. And even if it's not, because you can always argue against me by saying like, okay, those extreme circumstances are unlikely to occur. Yes, I actually admit that. I think that it's unlikely that the third-party providers are kind of the crazy all the time, right? So it's not gonna happen very often, or it's not gonna happen at all. But the problem is like most likely you are still facing the problem of the principal agent conflicts, or you are still facing the kind of the agency problems, aka also known as the principal agent problems. The thing is like you have to understand the incentives of the government are not the same as the incentives of the service providers, right? Because as the government or as government, your biggest goal is to provide the services and goods to the satisfaction of the citizens, right? And for those kind of the third-party providers, their biggest goal is to what? Is to save the cost, and is also to actually get things done quickly. So they can actually get paid by you. So they're holding the bare minimum criteria, trying to provide the services where they don't get a lot of complaints, so that you will keep using their services, but they don't want to actually provide it too extravagantly or like in a way that is perfect because they don't have the incentives to do so. They want to get paid quickly. They want to get paid whereas not putting a lot of effort or not putting into or investing a lot of money into the process. So they are trying to be cost effective, whereas you are trying to be perfect, right? So basically you have to understand that the incentives between the public and private sector players are not perfectly aligned. Saying like it's the same thing as like you actually go to a doctor to have some of your illness cured, or to at least try to actually take a look of your health condition, right? So basically you are the agent. You pay you are the principal. You pay the agent, namely the doctor, right? To basically cure your illness, right? Because you don't have the expertise to do it yourself. Your incentive, your biggest goal is what? Is to let the doctor spend as much time as possible to examine you, to give you the best recipe, or not the recipe, I'm sorry, the best remedy to actually solve the issues, or to at least cure your disease to make sure like you're healthy. But for the doctor, you can imagine his or her incentive is not the same as yours, because he or she is seeing a lot of patients every day. So his biggest goal is to get paid as usual, but spending as less time as possible or as little time as possible in you, right? So they can go to the next patient, right? So basically they want to actually say something so you are satisfied because you don't know, and then they will spend the least effort and then they can go to the next patient. So you always have to imagine that there's always a principal agent conflict. Like the principal delegates the authority to the agent to provide the service or to perform on his or her behalf, because you don't have the expertise or you don't have the professional knowledge to do it yourself, or you don't have time to do it all by yourself. But you do have to understand that sometimes, or in many circumstances, the incentives between the principal and the agents are not perfectly aligned. You have to use a lot of mechanisms like the contracts, like you have some penalty clauses, right? You have a lot of issues, or you have a lot of like mechanisms to make sure like they will try their best. But eventually, at the end of the day, you do have to understand that their incentives are not perfectly aligned. So a lot of the problems will actually occur. So when everything is hollowed out, you do have to understand that basically you are encountering the principal agent conflicts all the time, right? So because of, I asked you guys to do the MTR scandal, right? So that's one of the issues. Because of the MTR, its purpose is to actually get things done, to actually provide the public transportation to the satisfaction of to each of you, right? So, but in reality, the thing is like the contractors don't actually think so. Their purpose is to save money, is to actually save cost, is to actually try to actually get paid by the MTR on time, whereas not putting a lot of effort or not investing a lot of money into the process. They try to just hit the bare minimum criteria, not trying to actually go over the top. because I have no incentives to do so, right? As long as I can pass your inspection minimum, right, I can actually get paid. I can actually get paid, right? So basically, and then sometimes when you're actually working on the borderline, right, basically you are not trying to actually to do things to perfection, and then the problem would actually occur. That is, like in most circumstances, like some kind of the issues would actually occur, would actually abrupt, and then basically it's a scandal, and then people will think, oh, you didn't use the highest quality material, oh, you didn't actually try to actually do things very prudently, right? So basically a lot of issues would actually occur, right? So basically you do have to understand that when the whole state is hollowed out, you are embracing a hollow state, but the problem is like you are facing a lot more kind of the principal agent conflicts. You're actually facing more principal agent conflicts. That's something that we also have to keep in mind. So because we have a hollow state, and then that trend seems to be a little bit unstoppable, because you can't say like, okay, let's just go back, because there's no going back, right? We are entering the phase of a hollow state, and there's no going back. You cannot say, okay, now let's provide anything in-house, right? Let's keep the in-house production all the time. It's not possible, because now we are in a globalized world. We are demanding a lot of things, and government cannot do all the things by itself, right? So we are entering a phase. We have to admit that. But after admitting it, we do have to think of, okay, then how can we actually govern the hollow state? How can we actually govern the hollow state, right? Hollow state has its problems, but it has its liabilities, but it also has its advantages, right? So because we can't say like, let's just abandon the whole hollow state or abandon the collaborative governance scheme because of the weaknesses, right? Because it also has its benefits, right? What we need to do is to strike a balance so that eventually we can actually take advantage of we can make the most of its advantages, whereas also try to actually control or to contain those weaknesses. That's all we can do, right? So what we want to do is to actually well govern the hollow state, right? So basically there are a few elements you have to keep in mind. The first one is like, the legitimacy of the agents must be established, right? The legitimacy of the agent must be established. Why is that important? Saying like, okay, you are contracting out to company A today for a service, you're contracting out to company B for another service the other day. So basically you just keep choosing different service providers. What's the problem associated with that? It's like people don't know who is the relatively certified service provider of the government, right? Nobody actually knows. Okay, today you are using company A, tomorrow you're using company B. People don't have any information in terms of, okay, who are the companies that you actually trust the most, right? So basically you do have to give those agents or give those kind of the non-public sector players some legitimacy so that people would know, okay, when some problems occur, basically I can always find that company because that company always provides the services on behalf of the government. And also, the issue is because like, you can also think of in the shoes of the agents, right? When government always turn to you to provide the public services and goods, so basically you feel like you have a sense of responsibility because it's not a one-shot business. You don't want to cut corners, you don't want to actually save money to the extreme, to excess, because you know that there's gonna be another round of business for you to take up. So that you are willing to do something to the satisfaction of the citizens, to the satisfaction of the government, because you know if you do it well, you have next business lined up, right? However, if you don't give those agents some kind of legitimacy, you're using company A today, you're using company B the other day, the problem is like people will think that it's a one-shot business. I just get paid by you in a lump sum this time, and then basically that's it. Then I will try to be selfish, right? I will just try to grab as much profit as possible. I will not try to be responsible because next time you won't even be able to actually find me, right? So basically that's the issue. It's like sometimes the legitimacy of the agents must be established, right? So that if we have the weak legitimacy of the agents, say like you have the frequent repeating of the contracts, right? Even if it actually increases like the competitiveness of the contract, it tends to actually save the cost on behalf of the government, right? Because if you are in a competitive environment, right, sometimes you always get a lower bid. But the problem is like, it's gonna backfire. It's gonna be counterproductive because if you have a lot of kind of the repeating process going on, people will think like it's always a one-shot business, and people will not take it seriously, and people will try to just cut corners to take advantage of this business. You have to make things repeated, right? You have to make it like a repeated business, so people will be relatively more far-sighted. People will be relatively thinking of the long term. When you think of the long term, you are less likely to be selfish, right? You are less likely to be selfish, right? So that's also the strategy I actually adopted class, because I tell you guys, okay, next year that you guys will still have to take another course from me, right? So that you guys will still have to actually see me again for another course, right? So basically it's a long-term relationship, right? So you don't want to screw up the course for this time and thinking, okay, I will never be able to see you again. I will never be able to see this guy again. That's not gonna happen, right? Because you guys have to take another course from me. That's compulsory as well, right? So it's a long-term relationship. So then you will try to actually pay more attention to the class, right? So same thing, right? Same thing here, okay? So basically that's the process, okay? And then the second thing is like to govern a hollow state well, right? To govern those kind of contractors, those private sector service providers well, you do have to understand that adequate resources are always important, right? Basically it's a given, right? If you don't have the resources, right? If you don't have the funding, if you don't have like someone to oversight the process, right? Basically it's gonna be chaotic. It's gonna be chaotic. But if you need someone to monitor the process very closely, it costs money, it costs resources, because you have to pay that person, right? You have to pay that person, right? So basically, you have some inspectors, and then those inspectors are not cheap, right? So basically, in order to really have the quality control, you do have to invest. You do have to invest. And for you to be able to invest, you need resources. You need resources. But for government, that's not a big issue. It's not a big issue, right? It's not like exactly a big issue. As long as it wants to do something, it can always do. Particularly in those kind of rich jurisdictions or in those kind of wealthy states, it's not an issue. But you do have to understand in some developing countries, like in those kind of in those African countries, you do have to understand that sometimes the government is not as wealthy or is not as affluent as we think, right? Sometimes they're encountering or they're facing like a budget crisis. And like even in the US, even if the government has the money, it cannot actually spend as it wants, right? Because it has to actually go through the process, go through the approval process by the Senate, basically by the Congress, right? So sometimes they also have to actually deal with the kind of the budget cut. And the third one is about stability. You want to actually maintain a stable network. It actually echoes the first point. You want to actually legitimize those agents to make sure like they are the kind of the de facto kind of the certified service providers on behalf of the government, right? So that you want to maintain a very stable network. You always collaborate with a few companies, with company ABC. You don't actually go to company ABC this time and actually go to DEF the next time, right? You always want to actually resort to a stable network to have company ABC providing the services on your behalf. Obviously, you can change things a little bit occasionally, but not very frequently. Not very frequently. So that as long as you have a stable network, people will know that it's a long-term relationship. It's a long-term relationship, and people will not try to take advantage of this because it's not worthwhile, right? Even if you take advantage this time, you get a little profit, people will not use you anymore. Basically, it's you taking all the kind of it's at your own peril, right? However, if you try to actually be honest, right? Even if you're not earning as much profit as that one that is not very honest, but you are having a long-term relationship, then eventually things will actually accumulate. You are the biggest kind of the beneficiaries of it, right? So people will actually think in that way. And then that point is really important. And that point is something that the government often actually fails to achieve. It's like you need to have a risk-sharing attitude. You need to have the risk-sharing attitude for the government. For the government. It's like when something happens, you can imagine like the government that doesn't want to actually lose the trust from the citizens. So it would always say, okay, we are gonna closely investigate into the case and we will find someone to be held accountable personally for this matter, right? That's the official line of the government. They always want to actually blame or assign the blame to the third-party service providers to make sure like people will think like they're untainted. They're still very healthy, they're still very good, they don't have any fault. Like it's basically the fault of the third-party service providers, it's those kind of the companies, private companies that are so selfish that they don't do anything right. It's the same thing here as the MTR, right? The MTR doesn't think like it's their fault. They think it's the fault of the private company, the Lexton, right? The Lexton, right? So because of so, like sometimes they don't want to actually adopt a risk sharing attitude. When something happens, they just want to actually maintain themselves in a way that cannot be actually blamed, right? They don't want to be in a position of being blamed or being co-blamed by the public, right? That's okay, but the problem is like if you do so, and basically it tends to actually, how can we say it? It tends to disappoint those private sector players because sometimes it's not entirely the fault of those private sector players. Sometimes you might not be able to give them the full information. Sometimes perhaps like you didn't actually forecast all the contingencies, right? So sometimes it's not because of the private sectors trying to actually save cost or trying to just cut corners. It's because something just happened, right? So when those kind of unfortunate events actually happen, we think that the government needs to adopt a risk-sharing attitude. When you're willing to share the risk, when you are trying to at least take some of the blame, the private sector players will also try to actually come forth to actually take part of the blame. So people will actually try to solve the problems altogether. So it's going to be healthy in the long term. If you are trying to dodge all the blames, saying like it's your fault, and then the private sector players would also try to dodge the blame because they can't afford to take the blame all by themselves. It's too huge, right? It's too much. Because of this, they're trying to actually dodge it. Sometimes you can't even find the third-party players because they totally disappeared. Why? Because they are a little bit kind of afraid that they have to shoulder all the blames by the public. They have to shoulder all the cost, and sometimes it's too overwhelming. Right? So because of this, you do have to understand that if the government can actually take the initiative to share some of the risk, to share some of the blame, the private sector players would also be a little bit more forthcoming, and then things will be solved much easily. Things will be solved much more easily, right? However, if you are trying to dodge the blame, and then the other party will try to do the same thing, because no single party can shoulder all the blames by itself, it's too much. Then eventually it becomes like a game, a tit for tat, or like a blame assigning game. It's like everyone is trying to just point the fingers at the other, right? And nobody is trying to take advantage, or nobody is trying to solve the crisis, or is trying to solve the crisis with an honest attitude, right? That's just very unfortunate, right? So we do have to understand that sometimes you are trying to, if you just try to play a little bit more, how can we softly, if you're trying to be more lenient, resilient, right? Sometimes things can be solved much easily. Right? And then finally, it's like trust and shared values, right? That's important because, if you don't trust someone, you better not use them in the first place, right? So if you use them in the first place, right? If you just choose this company to provide service on your behalf, you'd better actually trust them, right? If you don't trust them, right? Basically, people will not trust you either, right? So it's a reciprocal relationship, and then everyone is trying to game the system, and then the whole thing will actually collapse. Obviously, you need some kind of the formal inspection processes, right? You need some checks and balance mechanisms to make sure like people will not be out of line, right? That's okay. That doesn't mean like you don't trust them, but then you do have to, at the same time, you do also have to actually give them some credit when credit is due, right? You do also have to actually acknowledge their benefits, acknowledge their strongest suit. You do have to acknowledge that they have an edge over you. Otherwise, you won't even be able to contract you out. You won't even actually find this company to contract out, right? So basically, you cannot say like when the whole event is done in a very magnificent way, and then you are trying to take all the kind of the credit and say like, okay, it's all because of me, right? You have to also acknowledge the credit of the third-party service providers, right? So basically, it's a trust, and then basically it's kind of the shared values. Eventually, you have to always articulate, okay, the values of what we are doing is blah blah blah, or are as follows, right? So basically, we're providing the service to the public so that eventually we can forge a very beautiful tomorrow. Sometimes you need those slogans, like people would actually feel like they have a mission in mind. Even for those private sector players, they're human beings after all. right? Sometimes if you can find those catchy and kind of touching lines, if you can actually really actually forge like a common mission, right? Sometimes people would actually follow that, right? So still you need to articulate the meaningfulness, the social meaningfulness and impactfulness of your work. Social meaningfulness and impactfulness of your work, right? So basically that's what I want to emphasize. And finally, for the final part of the lecture, we do have to understand that for most of the public sector or public management researchers at least, they are trying to do one thing, that is to evaluate the effectiveness of the public sector network or collaborative governance scheme. Because we have to deal with specifics, right? So when you are having like one collaborative governance scheme, like in the field of like the governing like the public parks, so to speak, right? Sometimes you want to imagine, or sometimes you're wondering whether or not that collaborative governance scheme is effective, right? So you are always trying to evaluate the effectiveness of the scheme, right? And how could you do that? It's complicated because it's multifaceted, and then you can't actually wait till something happens to evaluate the problem. It's gonna be too late, and most likely those big scandals won't actually occur ever since, right? So because of this, you do have to understand that you have to actually constantly review the effectiveness of those collaborative governance schemes. Right? You have to constantly review the effectiveness of those collaborative governance schemes, right? So that how could you do that? I mean, there are a lot of ways, right? But based on Provo and Millward, basically they are like the kind of the go-to scholars if you want to study the topic, because they're like the kind of the most famous, the frontier scholars studying the collaborative governance schemes, right? So according to their definition, right, in order to actually evaluate the effectiveness of the collaborative governance, we have to ask ourselves the question is whether or not we have satisfied basically the key stakeholders in this network. In this network, we have the public sector organizations, we have those private sector organizations, and then we also have the public, right? Because eventually the subject is the public, right? What you should always ask yourself whether or not you have actually worked to the satisfaction of those key stakeholders, right? Those key stakeholders. Well, there are a lot of like definitions surrounding like stakeholders, but eventually it's about each key participant in this process. To be specific, they believe that there are 3 levels at which the effectiveness of the collaborative governance can be evaluated, can be at least gauged, right? The first is at the community level. It's at the community level. It actually judged by the contributions it makes to the communities being served, right? Because eventually you're serving a community, right? Eventually you're serving a community. Depending on the scale, right? You can serve a community of the CityU students, you can serve a community of the Hong Kong residents, you can serve the community of the world. That's too large, but you can at least serve the community of the continent, right? So basically, you have to understand that at the community level, it depends on how much you have made, or how great your contributions are to the communities being served, right? So basically, you have a few kind of sub-criteria, saying like the overall cost of the treatment and services, right? Because eventually we are resorting to collaborative governance because you want to save the cost. You want to do things effectively but cheaply as well, inexpensively at least, right? So basically the overall cost and whether or not the needs are adequately met. Whether or not their needs are adequately met, right? If they have some needs of like doing a street cleaning, can't you actually do that in a day? Or you have to wait for like 20 days to get things done, right? Basically, if you live in a neighborhood, okay, if the lamp is out of light, can't you have someone to repair the lamp actually immediately or at least in a short notice? Or do you have to wait for the full cycle to get this done, right? So basically, you have to actually understand the second thing is about whether or not the client's needs are adequately met, are sufficiently actually met. The third one is about the contribution to the building of the social capital. That seems to be a little bit vague, but you do have to understand like sometimes we're talking about social capital, meaning we're talking about the mutual trust. Basically the trust among individuals. The trust among individuals. Say like I can say like basically now the social capital in societies are much weaker than before, right? Because these days in society, you don't trust people that often, you don't trust people that easily, or you don't trust people that widely. Like perhaps like 20 years ago, if you ask someone for the, if you ask a stranger for directions, people will be very passionate, people will be very polite. But nowadays, perhaps, if you ask people for directions, if you're a stranger approaching others, people will be a little bit intimidated. People would be very kind of, how can we say, a little bit kind of cold, right? Why? It's because like the kind of the trust among people gets a little bit decreased. The levels of trust among people gets a little bit decreased. People would think, okay, you are a scam, you are like some kind of the people trying to take advantage of me, because we have heard of the stories all the time, right? Don't talk to strangers because they're trying to kidnap you, something like this, right? Because of this, right, we can say like nowadays the social capital is really weak. The trust among people is really weak. It's not really there. So one of the key criteria to actually evaluate the effectiveness of the network at the community level is to make sure like you can always keep building the momentum of social capital. To make sure like people will trust each other, at least in this network, people will trust each other, right? People would actually have a high level of trust for the other party, would have a relatively high level of trust for the other party, right? So that's basically how we actually evaluate things at the community level. And basically at the network level, because it's a network, right? So sometimes we can also evaluate things at the network level, right? And one very direct indicator is what? Is basically the ebb and flow of the agencies to and from the network. Now you have a network of like 10 friends, so to speak. Okay, the year after this one, basically in 2020, you have only 8 friends in your network. And then a year after that, 5 friends. It means like what? You're becoming relatively unpopular, right? Because you can't keep your friends. You can't keep your friends. In your network, okay, your friends, the number of your friends just gets decreased, right? So now you have like 10 friends. And then the next year you have 20 friends. And the next year your friends actually gets exponentially increased. You have like 200 friends, right? It means like you're doing extremely well. At least you are on a kind of upward swing because you are getting increasingly popular. It happens, right? When you're nobody, you don't have a lot of friends. Your network only has like 10 participants, 10 friends. But when you become a celebrity, right? All of a sudden, you have a lot of friends in your network. Some of them are close, some of them are very kind of astray, but at least they're in your network, right? So basically, you can always imagine, you can always evaluate the effectiveness of the network based at least partially on the ebb and flow of the agencies to and from the network. How many participants can you keep? How many participants have you replaced? Or how many participants have you lost forever? Right? Because if you have a lot of like friends, or if you have a lot of participants in the network, it means like your network is really functional. Right? People like to actually stay in this network. However, if the number of the key participants, number of the key organizations in your network, just keep actually decreasing, it means like the network is not working very effectively, right? It means like people don't think that your network is worthwhile staying. It's not worth staying. People will think, okay, I'd rather actually just leave the network and actually find a new one. It means like your network is not attractive enough. Why? Because they cannot solve the problems, perhaps, right? So basically, you can always try to actually evaluate the effectiveness of the collaborative governance scheme at the network level based on how many key knots in this network you can actually keep as time goes by, right? So basically, that's another thing I actually want to emphasize. Obviously, there are also a lot of like nuances, like the multiplexionality, right? There are a lot of issues like you have to take care of as well, right? Things are complicated. Well, there are a lot of kind of sub-indicators, but in general, it depends on the ebb and flow of the agencies to and actually from the network, right? That's things at network level.